We hear from IQ radars, IQ targeting pod.
Cops on 1 traffic is now off your right lane, 3 miles.
The control tower coordinates a few dozen military flights a day, sending these spy planes dubbed Dragon Lady up over the Korean peninsula.
We're busier here than we've been probably in the last 10 years. We're very busy. But we are tasked every day to fly our mission, so we do that.
Pressurized suits allow pilots to soar at altitudes of 70,000 feet. That's twice as high as a commercial jet. The one-seater spy planes are flown by 8 specially trained officers. The job to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. A window for Washington into North Korea needed now as much as ever.
Everything that this aircraft is collecting is almost instantaneously sent down to people who can process, exploit, and disseminate that information in minutes to our leadership.
We would be ready to launch operations out of both airspaces or both air bases at a moment's notice and be ready to fight tonight.
Major Danny Trueblood is on a 2-year tour to South Korea, taking up a job that U.S. troops have done for decades, since the end of the Korean War.
The F-16s are pivotal to the to basically the defense and any potential actions. So with GPS or laser-guided weapons, we can strike a variety of different targets.
This U.S. airbase is fewer than 40 miles from the North Korean border. These supersonic jets can fly about 16 miles a minute. So in the case of a conflict with North Korea, they could reach the DMZ in just 2 to 3 minutes.
They practice daily, sometimes with mock battles. On this day, 12 of the Air Force's F-16 fighter jets take off.
Because we don't know. With the unpredictability of things, tonight may be, in fact, the night. So we train every night.
Still the same work they've done every day for decades. Now with the world watching what happens next. Alexandra Field, CNN, at Osan Air Base.
So NASA wants to get their hands on an app invented by a plastic surgeon that can help people track the solar eclipse. You're going to want to watch this one. I know that seems like an unusual tease. That's why it's a tease. Dr. Gordon Telephone joins us next with a closer look at how his app works.
Comments about Donald Trump.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. He also recently has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation.
Julie, the word that stood out to me in Corker's statement, Corker, usually mild-mannered guy, he's not an ideologue. He used the word the president, he questioned the president's stability, which is, striking.
It's incredibly striking, particularly given Corker's role the last several months. Corker is someone who, one, was considered for vice president, right. He was considered for secretary of state, and on foreign policy, he has really tried to be an active participant with this White House. He has gone over there numerous times, he engages with the staff. This is not one of these Republicans like a Jeff Flake who has been pretty consistently critical of this president. Mm-hmm. So for him to come out and use the words that he did, to question the stability and the competence of a sitting president of his own party
while he's up for re-election in 2018
in Tennessee, a reliably Republican state. I think sometimes we get a little numb to some of these comments that Republicans make, but when you actually think about Republican lawmakers saying these things about their own sitting president is really remarkable, and it speaks to a lot of the concern that they have that this will not get on track, that we are not headed in a good direction, and that the agenda that they want to implement is almost going to be impossible for Trump in this weakened position to carry forward.
Right, and then this from Newt Gingrich.
I think he's in a position right now where he is much more isolated than he realizes. On the Hill, he has far more people willing to sit to one side and not help him right now. You don't get down in the 35% range of approval and have people in your own party shooting at you and conclude that everything's going fine.
That is Newt Gingrich, right? and that happened on Friday, suggesting that, there's work still to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and this is the Bannon argument here. If you believe that Democrats aren't going to help you anymore, if you believe that the Republican establishment is going to abandon you at the first moment they can, which they have every time. Now they come back whenever Trump's numbers start to tack back up.
Right.
But if he can't keep the base, this goes from mid-30s, high 30s, which is bad, to mid-20s, low 20s, which is just inoperable.
Right. And this, I thought this was from the Washington Post, this was Tom Ridge, really getting at what next for these Republicans who've come out and questioning what they were doing. At what point does a principled party stand up for its principles? You can't be afraid of losing an election because you stood up for what was right. A party of principle requires leadership, but at this time, we're kind of rudderless. We need a chorus of opposition, and we didn't get it. And frankly, if we did that, I think most Americans would applaud. Jackie, to you on that. Tom Ridge from the Bush administration.
Right, and Tom Ridge, who was a somewhat moderate Republican in the House before he joined the Bush administration as Homeland Security Advisor. I think this all points to the fact of how important Tuesday and the rally in Arizona is. They've scheduled this. It has all the hallmarks of another in-your-face performance where he's at odds with both Republican senators there, has all but endorsed the opponent, as we were talking about, of Jeff Flake. And on top of that, he has teased that he may pardon former Sheriff Joe Arpaio, who's anathema to Latinos and many other people for his performance as Maricopa County Sheriff. And it has all the makings for quite a performance on the part of the president, and not the one people are looking for.
Right, and the question is whether or not with this, if he does all those things you're talking about, is there sort of a GOP chorus of opposition in the way that Tom Ridge thinks there ought to be? Coming up, a topic change.
Just that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?
That was President Trump on Tuesday, his argument that George Washington owned slaves too, so that makes him the same as Robert E. Lee. But the country isn't removing Washington statues, even as there has been a decades-long debate about what to do about Confederate symbols. Trump doubled down on his take on Confederate monuments on Thursday, tweeting, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments. You can't change history, but you can learn from it. Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, who's next? Washington, Jefferson? So foolish. Also, the beauty that is being taken out of our cities, towns, and parks will be greatly missed and never able to be comparably replaced." For Trump, this calculation is easy because most of the country and a majority of his base are actually with him on this. A new poll from NPR, Marist, and the PBS NewsHour finds that 62% of registered voters want the statues to stay put as symbols. And when it comes to white college voters without college degrees, a key group of Trump's base, 3 out of 4 of those voters say keep the statues where they are. Jackie, it certainly was a topic change for this president, really back to an argument that's been going on for decades, back to the 90s, the 80s. Right. So what was this about? Is he actually on safer ground?
He is on safer ground. I mean, it's easier to talk about inanimate statues than it was to be equating very live on tape neo-Nazis carrying assault weapons and torches with counter-protesters. But the figures you cited in that poll were taken sort of early in this brouhaha.
Yeah.
And to the extent that Trump now associates himself with the statues argument, you might see, I would predict you would see, the percentage of support for the statues remaining come down. Now, the thing about this is, one thing Trump also said that gets forgotten is he said it's really to the locals to decide. Well, the locals have been deciding for a long time, and it picked up after 2 years ago after the mass murder in Charleston. And it's been a very thoughtful, in most cases, debate at the local level about this. And they haven't been talking about taking down Washington and Jefferson.
Right, they haven't. It's these Confederate symbols.
Roiled these local debates.
Yeah, and Mike Signer had this to say. He was the Charlottesville mayor, and he, I think, talks about what you talks about, that it's sort of a different moment at this point.
All of a sudden, these monuments, these equestrian statues of Civil War generals that were installed in the Jim Crow era here, they became touchstones of terror. They became these kind of twisted totems that these people clearly are drawn to. They're trying to create a whole, architecture of of intimidation and terror and hatred around them. It was visited upon our town. It was evil.
Bender, you see some municipalities, college, Duke University, taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee. It does seem like we might be in a different moment, and that Trump might not be on as safe a ground as he thinks he is because of this the sense that these statues now are viewed differently.
Well, I think
because of their association with what happened.
Yeah, I think the point there is the numbers you showed. He's not talking to the people in Charlottesville, a small liberal college town, that see these statues as symbols of racism and symbols of slavery. He's talking to his base, who see these symbols as symbols of political correctness. Right? I mean, this is Trump's brand. Is the anti-establishment outside the box, and for these people, if I can speak for America for a second, they see, the political correctness for them has become this sort of verbal shell game that generally for the white working classes ended up with them being shamed out of a way of thinking, right, shamed out of a way of talking, shamed out of a way of living. And so when they hear Trump defending these sort of things, this is what they see as him bucking the establishment,
defending them. And this gets back to the sort of white identity politics, and Bannon saying he would love to see Democrats talk about racism every single day. Michael Warren.
Right. It's one of those things that people suggest is how Trump gets elected, right? The sort of PC culture. I was struck by, in that particular statement from Trump at the press conference, how much he sounds like the guy at the end of the bar. And that was such a part of his appeal during the election, right? He was saying the things that you really kind of.
But it's sort of the white guy at the end of the bar,
well, yes,
right?
Absolutely. But that is a part of his appeal. The problem is that when you're president, you're not just the white guy at the end of the bar, or you're not just the Republican guy in the working class town at the end of the bar, sort of saying what you sort of viscerally think about PC or the left or whatever. You have to.
His stories sourced by the best reporters now. Welcome to Inside Politics. I'm Nia Malika Henderson, filling in for John King. To our viewers in the United States and around the world, thanks for sharing your Sunday with us. President Donald Trump is looking to turn the page after a frenetic week that ended with Trump's chief strategist leaving his White House post. Trump's tumultuous 7 days included aftermath from his responses to the deadly Charlottesville protests, comments that exposed the fault lines for the country as a whole, as well as for Trump's own party. This Saturday, a different scene, mostly peaceful dueling rallies with thousands of protesters marching in Boston. President Trump weighed in with 3 different takes on the protests as the afternoon went by. He first tweeted at 3:22 p.m. Eastern, "Looks like many anti-police agitators in Boston. Police are looking tough and smart. Thank you." Another tweet at 4:34, "Our country has been divided for decades. Sometimes you need protests in order to heal, and we will heal and be stronger than ever before." Then another tweet, "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." Trump also used his favorite medium to talk about the latest White House shakeup. He waited almost 24 hours after the news broke to say this about Steve Bannon. "I want to thank Steve Bannon for his service. He came to the campaign during my run against Hillary Clinton. It was great. Thanks, S." And then this, Steve Bannon will be a tough and smart new voice at Breitbart News, maybe even better than ever before. Fake news needs the competition. But it's this picture from January 28th that says it all. It's President Trump surrounded by his senior staff, but former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, now gone, former Press Secretary Sean Spicer, also out, Chief of Staff Reince Priebus resigned, and most recently, Chief Strategist Steve Bannon fired. With us to share their reporting and their insights, Michael Warren of the Weekly Standard, Julie Pace from the Associated Press, the LA Times' Jackie Colmes, and the Wall Street Journal's Michael Bender. Another weekend and another White House staffer calls it quits. This time it was the key champion of the president's populist movement. The president indicated that he didn't know what was going to happen between him and Mr. Bannon, even though sources tell CNN his ouster had been in the works for 2 weeks.
Look, I like Mr. Bannon. He's a friend of mine. But Mr. Bannon came on very late. You know that. And I like him. He's a good man. He is not a racist, I can tell you that. He's a good person. He actually gets a very unfair press in that regard. But we'll see what happens with Mr. Bannon, but he's a good person, and I think the press treats him, frankly, very unfairly.
Mr. Warner, I'll go to you on this one. In many ways, the way that Steve Bannon has gone out, all of these interviews sort of making it about himself, really, I think, is exhibit A for many people of why he's no longer in the White House.
That's right. I mean, this is a new regime, at least within the staff of John Kelly. A lot of the reasons that John Kelly ousted Anthony Scaramucci, probably the same that ousted Steve Bannon. You remember this interview that Bannon gave with Robert Kuttner, a liberal, a very liberal journalist,
right, with the
American Prospect,
right, the American Prospect,
and in which he said many different things, including criticizing members of the administration, saying he was going to sort of win some of these personnel battles or what have you. I think if we look at that more so than anything else is a big reason why Bannon's not there anymore. And if you look at what the president's saying, he doesn't really want to say he doesn't want Bannon in his administration anymore. This is, I think, a perfect example of how the president sort of keeps his distance from any of that nasty business of firing people or having to move on from people who've just become a problem for his administration.
He seems to leave it to some other people, in this case, Kelly. Julie, one of the things, Mr. Bannon talked to your outlet, the Weekly Standard, and he had a pretty bold statement. He said on Friday, the Trump presidency that we fought for and won is over. We still have a huge movement, and we will make something of this Trump presidency. But that presidency is over. Startling words from Bannon. What did he mean, and why did he say it?
It's a pretty stunning statement, and it hits on a couple of things that people in the White House actually have been worried about as the discussions have gone on about Bannon leaving. They happened earlier in the year as well, when he was really clashing with Jared Kushner. And it is that Bannon actually is the one person who's been in the West Wing who really represents the ideology that Trump ran on. Trump himself is not particularly ideological, but he really latched on to a lot of things that Bannon has been talking about, that Breitbart has been pushing for several years. And this idea that Bannon would now be moved outside gives people a lot of concern about what direction this White House is going to take. Are they going to move more toward a more moderate, perhaps democratic position? I think that's probably unlikely that Trump goes all the way there, but it's a worry. But then also the things that Bannon hinted at in that interview make it very clear that he is not going to be a silent bystander, even though he's on the outside now.
Right. And Julie, you mentioned where the president goes, this idea of, does he reach out to Democrats? The Democrats, they released a statement, the DNC National Press Secretary Michael Tyler. Here's what they had to say. There is one less white supremacist in the White House, but that doesn't change the man sitting behind the Resolute desk. Jackie, what are they trying to say there? I mean, are there more white supremacists in the White House? And this idea of, is this really a reset?
Well, leaving that aside, I think they're absolutely right that moving Bannon out, I wrote that he was, some people were treating him like he was a ventriloquist and Trump was his puppet. If there was a week that showed that wasn't true, it was this one with the remarks on Charlottesville, where the president just held forth extemporaneously and we saw, his true feelings. One of the things about Bannon's departure that I think gets overlooked in all the talk about white supremacists in Charlottesville, you could go back to last week when we were all talking about North Korea. Steve Bannon was a real voice within the administration for against the hawks, as he perceived it. And he was really upset when the president just off the cuff said what he did about a potential military operation in Venezuela, and he was very upset with the president's rhetoric towards North Korea, the sort of militaristic
and contradicted the president in that American Prospect article.
Exactly. And so I think that's what's going to be interesting. And we're still waiting for the president's decisions on Afghanistan, which was the purpose of his Camp David meeting on Friday, from which Bannon, of course, was excluded. So there's I think a lot of people in the base are also looking at what Trump, just how interventionist and expansionist abroad he's going to be, because many of them thought they were electing someone who was going to retrench, rebuild America, as he said during the campaign.
Right, and Michael Bender Bannon returns to Breitbart. He was hailed as a hero on their homepage on Friday. The homepage of the Breitbart News was Stephen K. Bannon returns home to Breitbart News as a populist hero. What are we going to see now? Because in many ways, I mean, if you talk to people familiar with the way Breitbart was operating when Bannon was inside the White House, he was still in some ways pulling the strings, even though he was not formally there at Breitbart.
Yeah, certainly had an influence, and Breitbart, the past 8 months has been filled with people that Steve Bannon hired in the years beforehand. So even if he wasn't directing it, it was his imprint on Breitbart. Breitbart, Steve is referred to as his killing machine, and that's what he knows, and that's what he's going to start doing. You mentioned the Weekly Standard interview, which I think is relevant. He also gave an interview to Bloomberg where he said he's not going to war with Trump, he's going to war for Trump. And you can kind of parse that by, if this president starts to tack left, starts to tack moderate, Steve Bannon and Breitbart will point that out. They have so far. But that's still, it remains to be seen here. Breitbart is not going to get any sort of resonance by attacking Trump for firing Bannon. No one really cares about Bannon. Bannon did not get elected, but conservatives are watching for signs of success for this president. Haven't seen it yet, and so far they've been able to blame the media and blame Washington Republicans. But if they start blaming the president, if they start seeing the president as not being able to keep his own house in order, that's where I think it's real trouble, and that's where I think Bannon leaving is a marker for them.
Right, and he certainly wants to make it that way. He seems to be doubling down on this idea that it is the establishment, the Republicans' establishment, who don't really want to go along with this president or support him. Up next, Bannon says this means war, how his departure could change the inner workings of the White House and its priorities. But first, saying goodbye to Steve Bannon means also saying goodbye to SNL's version of Trump's former aide. You may remember him as the way out. He said he plans to fight from the outside for President Trump's populist agenda. He told Bloomberg's Josh Green, quote, "I'm leaving the White House and going to war for Trump against his opponents on Capitol Hill, in the media, and in corporate America," end quote. But going to war for what? Now, this list may shed some light on that. Here's Bannon back in May, standing in front of his famous whiteboard, showing a long list of Trump's campaign promises. Some of those priorities included repealing Obamacare, major tax reform, a border wall, just to name a few. Now, back in February, which just seems a few short months ago, Bannon told the crowd at CPAC to make sure that the Trump White House is getting check marks on that big board of promises.
We're at the top of the first inning of this, and it's going to take just as much fight, just as much focus, and just as much determination. And the one thing I'd like to leave you guys today with is that we want you to have our back. But more importantly, hold us accountable. Hold us accountable to what we promised. Hold us accountable for delivering on what we promised.
Now, Bannon does have a loud, very big, and relentless platform at Breitbart, but it's all about who's left in the West Wing. People who, by and large, did not represent Bannon's worldview. And here's the list, and we can put it up, of who's left. You have John Kelly, H.R. McMaster, Cohn, Kellyanne Conway, who seems in some ways to have receded a bit, and the people sort of from the Bannon wing, Stephen Miller and Sebastian Gorka, are still there. Julie, who do we think has the presidency here? Who do we think is ascendant at this point in this White House?
Well, what John Kelly's there to do is try to control who has the presidency here. That's one of his big tasks right now, is to keep this from being a revolving door in the Oval Office where you have people from different factions, each going in, each getting to sort of say their piece, and then coming back in after their rival leaves to say their piece again. Look, I think this is the big question with Bannon's departure, is what direction does the administration go on policy? Because the reality is, I mean, I've always been struck by this in talking to Trump voters during the campaign, and now it's not just a cult of personality that got him elected. People who voted for him really supported a lot of the policy ideas that he put out there. Building a wall along the border, the travel ban. These were actual policy proposals that really resonated. And in talking to Bannon and others, they really feel like the wall, beyond everything else, if Trump gets to the end of this term and hasn't built the wall, the disappointment for his voters would be tremendous. And would he then fall into the same trap that so many other politicians do, where they make big promises on the campaign, can't deliver, and then Americans look at them as, just another politician who broke their promises?
And Trump tweeting about Afghanistan, previewing what'll likely at some point be an announcement on the strategy there. He said, important day spent at Camp David. This was on Saturday, with our very talented generals and military leaders, many decisions made, including on Afghanistan. That tweet came on Saturday. Bender, I want to go to you on this. Whatever he decides, this is going to tell us something about the Trump doctrine. It's also going to tell us where he is on that spectrum of kind of Republican approaches to foreign intervention. Julie talked about what his base expected. I think they didn't necessarily expect more foreign entanglements, particularly not in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's right. I think the last couple of weeks, last maybe month or so, we've seen more of a kind of a nationalist versus national security fight within the White House instead of the nationalist versus globalist. This will be an indication of where Trump is going. It's hard for me to imagine he tacks too much away from where he's been. We just look at the last week. Jackie made a point a little bit earlier. We have the first trade action against China. The news conference was remarks on infrastructure. That was actually supposed to be about infrastructure. The defense of Confederate symbols. This is the nationalist agenda at a time when the person who best represents that ideology was just act from the administration. So I would not expect a big surge in troops in Afghanistan. I don't think he's going to privatize it either. Probably somewhere in the middle. But we'll see. I think we'll hear some numbers on that pretty soon.
And Bannon, in yet another interview, he gave one to the Weekly Standard. He also gave one to the Washington Post. Said this about a House divided, essentially, in this administration. He said, no administration in history has been so divided among itself about the direction, about where it should go. Jackie, in some ways, that seems to flow from the top. What does Trump want to do with his presidency, I think, is still kind of a question in a lot of people's minds.
Right, absolutely. And how many times have his spokespeople gone out and had to defend things he said only to have him then contradict them later? And, all of this talk now you hear as August winds down and they think about coming back in the fall about, we're going to really bear down on tax reform and infrastructure and and maybe even return to health care. But the fact of the matter is, they're going to need all the time they have just to do the must-do things, like finish passing the appropriations bills by October 1st, which they won't do, so they'll do a big package and unless the government shut down, and more important, raise the debt limit. Now, what's going to happen, I think, and even more since Bannon has left, is that the conservative wing is going to try to add things to
House
that
Freedom
debt
Caucus,
limit and to the budget bills that will, whether it's funding the wall or something much more ambitious even than that, and it will hold this up, and the Republican Party will be at war with itself, and the threat is that we will be having a fiscal brinkmanship with the full faith and credit of the United States.
Deja vu all over again, Michael Warren.
Right. Well, let me just say that I think Bannon made the mistake that a lot of people made with Donald Trump, which is that he mistook Donald Trump's willingness to adopt, Bannon's worldview as a sincere adoption of his worldview. And the truth of the matter is that Donald Trump, as a president, Donald Trump as a politician, is for and about Donald Trump. He's not about economic nationalism unless it serves his interests. He's not about globalist unless it serves his interests. And that's a big problem for anybody who sort of invests any kind of ideological hope in Donald Trump. He's going to do at the moment what he thinks is best for himself and his presidency. It was just a mistake that Bannon made.
Right, and you see a lot of GOP senators sort of realizing that and not wanting to stick their necks out, and in fact really coming out, particularly around Charlottesville over this last week. Up next, an off-the-rails press conference leaves Team Trump in to talk about Charlottesville as his senior staffers watch from the sidelines. Now, sources tell CNN that his aides were caught off guard, saying that the president just went rogue. Trump, he started off by commenting who was actually protesting.
I've condemned neo-Nazis. I've condemned many different groups, but not all of those people were neo-Nazis, believe me. Not all of those people were white supremacists by any stretch. Those people were also there because they wanted to protest the taking down of a statue, Robert E. Lee.
Then Trump basically seemed to equate some of the neo-Nazis and white supremacists with the protesters who were there to condemn them.
I'm not putting anybody on a moral plane. What I'm saying is this. You had a group on one side and you had a group on the other, and they came at each other with clubs, and it was vicious, and it was horrible, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But there is another side. There was a group on this side, you can call them the left, you've just called them the left, that came violently attacking the other group. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
There was violence coming from both directions, but only one side gathered the night before to denounce Jews, minorities, and others. Trump's about face, essentially blaming both sides equally, had Republicans speaking out against him and his comments.
I'm not going to defend the indefensible. I'm not here to do that. I'm here to be clear and to be concise and succinct. His comments on Monday were strong. His comments on Tuesday started erasing the comments that were strong. What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens.
Bender, why did this happen? Why did Tuesday happen? He seemed to really relish that moment, to want that moment. What was going through his mind at that point?
Well, this is sort of example A of why Steve Bannon leaving the White House probably isn't going to matter. Yes, General Kelly's brought in to bring some more command and control to this White House, but Tuesday happened, and there is the silence out of the administration and the silence out of the West Wing when it comes to disavowing what he said. One person gave Trump a full-throated endorsement of that performance, and he got fired on Friday.
Right.
This is going to resonate for a while, watch for as Trump goes out to this public event on Tuesday out in Arizona. He's got a big split with the Republicans on the Hill. He's already sort of implicitly endorsed the sitting senator from Arizona, his primary opponent.
Jeff Flake, right.
Yeah, and I know that his primary opponent is trying to get some face time at that rally. So out of a number of things that that we'll all be watching for Tuesday night, if the primary opponent shows up at this rally, it's going to be a big indication that Trump is not interested in healing the divide on Capitol Hill.
Jackie, we did hear a different kind of Trump in terms of his reaction to the protesters on Saturday. He said, "I want to applaud the many protesters in Boston who are speaking out against bigotry and hate. Our country will soon come together as one." It was different from the first two tweets that he tweeted out about that protest. Is this John Kelly literally grabbing his phone and tweeting something different?
Exactly. It had that feel, didn't it? It was because when his first tweets, you thought, he was going to really be critical of the counter-protesters. And he pulled back, and I don't know if he was watching cable and saw that it was largely, in Boston, 40,000 people, largely peaceful. Yes, there were over 30 arrests, but they weren't for, disturbing the peace kind of things. And there were, there's elements, there are people there that were just looking for violence, but very, very few. And so you just had this sense that there was an intervention there in the, wherever he was. I can't even remember. He's been flitting about on this
working vacation. Yeah.
But back to the question of why did he make that Tuesday statement? You go back to Saturday, previous Saturday, when Charlottesville happened, and you basically heard him say what I think he really wanted to say, which was that people are bad on both sides.
That was his impromptu from what he was saying.
From the podium. Then he was sort of pressured into giving this Monday statement in which he really went after neo-Nazis, white nationalists. The idea that you'd have to be pressured to say that is beyond me. Then Tuesday, I think he really felt like he needed to say what he really wanted to say.
Trump unleashed.
Exactly, because he's the president. He can't go rogue. I love the idea that he could go rogue. He's the president of the United States.
He can go
He's the one who
anything.
does whatever he wants. And I think It's interesting. You look at the comments. This is a classic example of how Trump sort of takes true-ish statements, right? For instance, there are people out there who are peacefully protesting the removal of Robert E. Lee statues, for instance. Except they weren't there at the protest in Charlottesville. They, in fact, said we didn't want anything to do with
those guys, right?
That is a perfect example of how Trump sort of takes the truth and then bends it and warps it into something that's not only not true, it ends up being offensive.
Right, something that pleased David Duke did not please many members of his party. They came out pretty strongly over the following days. A lot of people drew attention to Senator Corker. Let's close by asking our reporters to share something from their notebooks and help keep you ahead of the curve on the big political news in the coming weeks. Michael?
Well, how are the day-to-day operations going to change in the White House without Steve Bannon? Not much, actually. I'm told that he spent much of his time, particularly in the last several months of his time at the White House, sitting on a couch in the office of Reince Priebus, scrolling through his phone. But what was he doing there? He was trying to run a sort of an outside media campaign against his enemies, on behalf of his agenda, people like H.R. McMaster, Gary Cohn. I guess we're going to see more of that, and it's going to intensify from outside the White House. The difference now will be he's not in the White House, so he may not have the goods that he had while he was a West Wing employee.
Right, unless Trump continues sort of the relationship even after Bannon is gone. Julie?
Democratic activists are pretty energized after this past week, but Democrats that I talked to who are involved in some of the competitive Senate races for 2018 and certainly the efforts to win back the House are a little more anxious about this idea of Democrats going all in on Trump's response to Charlottesville. They see Democrats potentially falling into some of the same traps that they fell into in 2016, where they ran mostly on an anti-Trump message, and the party still feels like it's an economic message that needs to resonate with voters. The irony, of course, is that Chuck Schumer and some other Democrats have rolled out an economic blueprint for Democrats, but it's been completely overshadowed this summer by all of the antics surrounding Trump in the White House.
Yeah, they still got some work to do. Jackie?
I wanted to talk about the helplessness